Financial Planner. Follow us on YouTube.
Today, President Trump announced some of the details of his highly anticipated tax reform, which is really not tax reform. It's more of a tax cut masquerading as a reform. I would say the best part about it is the elimination of the estate tax. I mean, that in and of itself is a very substantial improvement. That tax should not be there. It's a horrible tax. It raises very little revenue but does tremendous damage, particularly to businesses. It impedes the ability of a family business to be passed down from generation to generation. It leads to the destruction and the dismantling of businesses, to the loss of know-how and ingenuity and jobs. And it's just a horrible tax that has a basis as nothing other than envy and greed, and it appeals to the lowest. It's unfair that some people to inherit money when others don't, and so let's take that money away from the people who are just born with in the lucky sperm. But when you get beyond all that envy, you see the real benefit of the ability of a businessman, of an individual, to be able to think and invest beyond his own lifetime, to build a business for his children, for his grandchildren, and for his grandchildren's grandchildren. And keeping these businesses going, passing down the know-how and the capital from generation to generation benefits everybody. Nobody benefits when a business has to be liquidated to pay an estate tax. Nobody benefits when people have to shorten their time horizons and they can't make long-term investments that extend beyond their own lifetime. So getting rid of the estate tax is a very big plus, and it is the best thing about this tax, and it doesn't add to the deficit. Again, the estate tax generates very little revenue for the government. It generates lots of revenue for lawyers and estate planners who can avoid the tax. I have personally spent a lot of money on estate planning, trying to set up trusts so that my children can inherit more of the money that I earned. I would, all this money was a waste. It didn't have to be spent if there was no inheritance tax. Now, if the inheritance tax goes away, then maybe I wasted all that money. But of course, just because the inheritance tax goes away under Trump doesn't mean it can't come back in 4 years under another president, because no tax cut is permanent. And so even if they get rid of it, I'm not going to believe it, that it's not going to be resurrected. So I'm not going to abandon the trust that I've already set up. But to the extent that we get rid of this horrible tax, that is a good thing. Now, as far as the rest of the plan, yeah, I like lower taxes. I like fewer brackets. I'd like to have just one bracket, right, to have a flat tax, although I'd like to flatten it all the way to zero. But under the president's plan, there are 3, 12, 25, and 35. I just assume it'd be one bracket of 25, right? If we're going to have an income tax, let's make everybody pay the same rate. That way, you don't have one group of people voting to tax another group of people. But it is an improvement over the number of brackets we have now. But again, remember, some future president could just expand on these brackets. And, it's happened before. We reduce the number of brackets, and then all of a sudden, we get more creeping right back in. So that will probably happen. In fact, they're already talking about now adding a fourth bracket, because the highest bracket at 35% represents a reduction of the current top rate of 39.6. Of course, the top rate is not 39.6. You got to add the 3.9% Obamacare tax. And of course, a lot of people have to add the state income taxes, which, by the way, if this passes, will no longer be deductible. That seems to be the one deduction that they were willing to give up, is state and local taxes, but they preserve the home mortgage deduction. I mean, personally, I'd rather see it be the other way around. Get rid of the home mortgage deduction and allow people to deduct their state income taxes, because I've got a problem with taxing people on money they never got, right? If the state taxes you, you never get that money. Why should the federal government tax you on the money that you never got, that the state took from you before you had a chance to get it? I think that is a bad idea. I did another podcast on that. I disagree. I think if you're going to tax income, you can't tax the income that was taken from the citizens by the state before they got it. In fact, it may even be unconstitutional. It's an infringement on states' rights. But of course, the judges never really enforce the Constitution anyway. But why keep the home mortgage deduction? It's all politics. That deduction is bad. It's bad economics. If we're going to have an income tax, deduct from their income what they choose to spend on mortgage interest. See, that's a choice. You don't have a choice about whether or not to pay your state taxes. You live in the state of Connecticut, you earn income in the state of Connecticut, you got to buy that tax. There's nothing that says you have to buy a house, and there's nothing that says you have to take out a mortgage on your house. That's a decision that you make. That's a choice. That's how you spend your money, right? So you shouldn't get a deduction on your income tax based on the way that you choose to spend your money. That's the government trying to micromanage your decisions, try to distort and influence the economy. It should stop. But you have the housing industry is a big factor, and they come in there and they influence the tax code. So it's because of the swamp creatures that the mortgage interest deduction is there. Now, the standard deduction is doubled, and so what this means is, to the extent that more people now utilize the standard deduction, fewer people will itemize. And of course, itemizing is less advantageous because you can't include your state and local taxes. Now, if you own real estate, right now you deduct not only your mortgage interest, but your property taxes. You can no longer deduct your property taxes. And so obviously that will reduce the value of real estate because it increases the after-tax cost of owning it, because you can no longer deduct from your federal tax the cost of your property tax. But also, it will mean that more people will choose to take the standard deduction rather than itemize, because you've reduced the value of the itemizing deduction because it's just your mortgage interest. It's no longer your property taxes. But now you've increased the value of the standard deduction. So that means fewer people will have a tax-based incentive to buy a home, right? Fewer moderate income people that are earning $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, that have, 2 or 3 kids. Fewer of those households will be incentivized by the tax code to buy a house, which means more of those households will rent. And so it's still going to hurt the real estate market, just not as much as it would have hurt the real estate market had they got rid of the deduction completely. But, the other problem with this is that I believe that it is going to complicate the tax code, not simplify it. I mean, Trump is out there trumpeting this as, this is a major tax reform. It's going to make things a lot simpler. I don't think it's going to make it simpler at all. I think it's actually going to make the tax code more complex, apart from the fact that we're getting rid of the estate tax. I mean, that is, again, that's a big deal. But let's set that aside and just look at the income tax component. And I think the income tax component is going to be more complex if this particular bill were passed, in its current form. I think it would be tax complication and not tax simplification. And by the way, when Trump did his press conference today to announce this plan, he started off, the very first thing he talked about was he took credit for the historically low rate of unemployment. He's like, unemployment is the lowest it's been in 16 years. This is fantastic. The economy is booming. I cannot stand this. It just boils my blood when you have a candidate who ran and said the biggest fraud is the low unemployment statistics. This is a lie. This is a con. The real rate is 30%. The real rate is 40%. The politicians are lying to you. And now he's telling the same lie. Now he's perpetuating the same con. It's the same fraud. The hypocrisy just makes me doubt everything he says. I can't stand it. That's the one thing that pisses me off more than anything else, is hypocrisy. Trump is being a massive hypocrite when he takes credit for the very low unemployment that he criticized Obama for. Nothing has changed. It's the same numbers. If it was phony then, it's phony now. So Trump is the phony. It's unfortunate. And some of you are pissed off at me because now I'm against Trump. Look, I was never that enthusiastically in favor of him, but I liked him better than Clinton. And I agree with him on the NFL. In fact, my wife, we're boycotting. I mean, she's a big fan. She loves Tom Brady and New England Patriots. I mean, she loves watching football. She won't let me watch football anymore. So we're now boycotting the NFL. And this is a little bit of a side note. But look, I think Trump is right to call out the NFL. Now, I believe in the First Amendment, right? And I certainly believe that the NFL, if they don't want their players to stand for the national anthem, if they want to let them, get on their knees, or, if they want them to drop their pants and moon, I mean, they're allowed to do that if that's what they want to do, right? But the fans, they don't have to buy tickets. And I think that if you're going to play the national anthem, and there's no requirement that they start a football game with the national anthem, right? I mean, but the NFL chooses to do that. And that is an appeal to patriotism. And if you're going to play that anthem and you're going to announce, please stand for our national anthem, and the players on the field are not going to stand, I mean, that's a problem. I mean, if you're not going to tell your players to stand, then don't play the national anthem, or play the anthem before they take the field. But this idea that you're going to have these players disrespect the very flag that everybody in the audience is standing, to honor, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me, and I can see why people would get mad. And the NFL should not allow it. I mean, look, people say, well, the players have a First Amendment right. Yeah, they do, but they're on the job. They're on the clock. They're being paid. I mean, you can't just show up at your job, at your office, and demand your right to protest. I mean, your boss can tell you what you can do while he's paying you, while you're on the clock. You don't have your First Amendment rights to say whatever you want when you are working, when you are being paid, right? You have your First Amendment rights on your own time, on the weekends, after hours, right? But even these NFL players, they have clauses in their contracts because they're public figures. They represent the team. They represent their sponsors. So even there's a limit to what they can say publicly, because it might taint their image, and they've got, morals clauses in their contracts. So, they don't really have the First Amendment rights to just, to just do whatever they want in a football stadium. But it's the owners of the teams that need to do that. So if the owners of the teams are going to allow their players to, have political protests and, and disrespect the flag, if they want to allow that, then they're allowed to do it, because they're the boss. They're the ones that they own the business. They are paying the players. And the fact that they're allowing it, and Trump was angry. He says, why don't they fire? Why doesn't one of these owners fire one of these players? Yeah. And, and I would agree. And to think that they can't control them, everything they control. These guys, if they celebrate too much in the end zone, right, there's a penalty for that. They control what the players do. And, of course, they control how they play the game, how they have to drop into a stance, how many men are on the field, how they can hit you, what kind of blocks are legal, what kind of blocks are illegal. I mean, they do all kinds of things. They control so many aspects of the player's game. You don't think they can say, and by the way, when we play the national anthem, you stand up and, you look like you respect the country, whether you do or not. You're going to pretend that you do. Look, nobody is probably angrier at the U.S. government than me. And look at what the U.S. government did to my father, how they basically murdered my father, right? So I have a lot of contempt for our government, but I love the country, and there's a difference. And I don't necessarily love what the country has become, but I love what the country stands for in theory. And I'm proud of my American heritage. And whenever I go to a football game and they play the national anthem, I'm standing up, because I understand what that song represents. I understand what that flag represents. Even if I don't like the government that is running this country, the government is different from the country. The government is different from the flag and the anthem that signifies what the country stands for and what many people died for in the past. So you got to respect that. But you know what? If you're going to play that national anthem in a football, and you're going to claim this is America's sport, you're going to wrap yourself in the flag when you play the anthem, and you want to kind of market the NFL as being American, because there's always that, America's pastime, baseball, right? There's always that conflict between what's America's sport, or is it football? And football's been trying to, win that spot, because baseball was always seen as an American sport, the national pastime. And so football, kind of challenged baseball. And one of the ways they wanted to appeal to that is, with bringing in the national anthem and bringing in all that stuff. So if you're going to do that, then, you make sure that your players are representing that flag. And the fact that they're not doing it, To me, I agree. If people aren't watching these games, then don't watch it. Just show the NFL that you don't disrespect what America stands for when you're trying to claim that you're all patriotic and this is all America, and then you're going to put people through that. And it's not about the First Amendment, because the NFL has the right to express this opinion, and the fans have the right to express their disgust, because you know what? These are football stadiums. This is not a place for politics. People are going there to watch a football game. It's a sport. There shouldn't be a debate about politics. There's a time and there's a place for that. They should keep football about football and let Democrats and Republicans go to the football game and enjoy the football game. And if they're going to play the national anthem, they can all put their political differences aside and they can stand and show some respect. And if the people in the stands don't want to do it, obviously the NFL, they cannot force the fans who bought tickets to stand up, but they can force their players who they're paying multi-million-dollar salaries, who are staying there on the field for everybody to see. They should be making them stand up. And the fact that they're not, well, I think that says a lot. And I agree with the sentiment that people are boycotting. But let me get back. This is not really what I wanted to spend the podcast talking about. I want to get back to the tax cut. But I just want to say that, look, if I agree with Trump, I will say I agree with him. If I disagree with him, then I'm going to say that. In fact, one thing that I really disagree with Trump on is he refused to grant a waiver for the Jones Act to Puerto Rico, which is a horrible decision. I mean, first of all, they should repeal the Jones Act. But at a minimum, they should suspend it for the next year or two while Puerto Rico is rebuilding, because all of the basic materials that they need and the basic supplies that they need to be imported. And why force the cost of those imports to go through the roof with the Jones Act? And of course, it will make the bailout easier. I mean, because ultimately, right, the U.S. government is going to be spending money to bail out Puerto Rico. Well, the bailout will be less expensive if they can suspend the Jones Act. Why is the president thinking that the jobs of like 1,400 merchant marines are more important than the lives of 3.5 million Americans who are trapped in Puerto Rico right now? Why can't they trade with the entire world? Why can't ships bring cargo from all over the world to Puerto Rico? Why do they have to go to the United States, unload and reload, and put them on an American ship where the costs are much higher and the process takes much longer? To me, it just shows Trump is in the pockets of big labor. He is making a political decision. He doesn't want to go against his base. He doesn't want to go against organized labor, American jobs, even though this is not that many jobs and the damage that's done. In fact, if you want to go back to day one, the Jones Act has done a lot more damage, economic damage, to Puerto Rico than Hurricane Maria. That's the reality. And the fact that Trump is not going to relieve the island of that hardship during this very, very difficult time just shows you how big politics weigh in his decisions and how captive he is. Like he said, hey, I'm gonna drain the swamp. This is what a swamp creature would do. And, there's a lot of political cover. I mean, even if, you're afraid to go against organized labor, the humanitarian crisis going on in Puerto Rico right now gives you the cover. I mean, anybody can say, look, we got to do this. Look at these pictures. There's no water. There's no power. There's no phone. There's no internet. The place has been leveled. We've got to do this. Everybody would forgive it. But he is standing tough. He is saying, I am going to preserve the profits and the wages of this small industry at the expense of all these people in Puerto Rico. I don't care about the free market. I don't care about, I'm a protectionist. That's who I am. And I'm going to protect these jobs over all else, no matter how much economic damage it does. And that really shows you what we are dealing with. But let me get back to the tax bill and why I think that it is going to complicate rather than simplify the current tax system. So they're going to go to three brackets, 12, 25, and 35. And by the way, they're actually increasing the lower bracket from 10 to 12, and they're reducing the highest bracket from 39.6 to 35. That, I think, is going to have some political problems, even though they are doubling the standard deduction, which means that most people that are in the 12% bracket will still get a tax cut. because they're going to be paying 12% on a smaller number because more of their income is going to be exempt completely from tax. But it's still optically, it's not going to look good, right? We're raising the bottom and we're lowering the top. So that's I don't think the optics of that are very good. I don't know, what made them do that. But here's going to be the problem. They lower the corporate tax rate to 20%. That's good. I'm all for that. I mean, the corporate tax rate should be 0. So 20% is closer to 0 than 35. So, hey, I'm all fine with cutting the corporate tax rate. But they cut the pass-through tax rate, which has nothing to do with the corporate tax rate. And they're cutting that from the current top rate of 39.6 down to 25. And they're doing this, in theory, to help small business. Well, in theory, small business will already benefit from lower taxes because the pass-through rate, right? If you have an LLC or an S Corp, the taxes are based on your personal rate. So if you're a small business owner and you're running a small business and your income is only $50,000 a year, you're going to pay tax that's somebody that earns $50,000 a year, which is much lower than, let's say, if you're running a business and you're earning $1 million a year. If you're running a business and earning $1 million a year, well, then you're going to pay at the higher rate. So the tax code, the way it's now, if you run a small business and you really are small, you're not paying the 39.6%. You're only paying that if you're running a small business in a way that makes you a lot of money, right? So you get into the upper bracket. Well, what this plan does is it says that, well, if you organize yourself into a LLC or S Corp, your top bracket is 25%. But if you get wages and salary, now there you have a big incentive, right, for people who are currently being paid wages to resign, incorporate, and work as independent contractors to lower their tax bracket. And obviously, there are already a lot of people, wealthy people, who are operating LLCs, whether they're lawyers, accountants, hedge fund managers, who are paying taxes at the 39% rate, who would now be paying taxes under the 25% rate. Now, what I've read is that there are plans to deal with this, that they are going to have all sorts of rules and regulations to try to make it more difficult for people to game the system. So they're going to try to exempt maybe certain types of income from being qualified for the lower tax. So maybe certain service income won't qualify. And of course, maybe they're going to require that if you work for your own LLC, that you have to pay yourself a marketable wage before you can pay yourself a profit. So meaning, let's say you run an LLC and you're the CEO of your own LLC. Well, you have to pay yourself a market-based salary before you can pay yourself a profitable distribution, because the market-based salary would be subject to the higher rate, plus it would also be subject to payroll taxes, whereas the profit distribution would not be subject to the payroll tax. It would be subject to the lower marginal tax. So they're gonna try to say, well, you have to pay this, but all that means accountants and lawyers and audits to try to determine, is the rate of compensation that you're paying yourself, is it accurate? Are you paying yourself too little? How do you justify it? What are the comps? And then, of course, if they're going to have all kinds of safeguards and all kinds of ways that the IRS can disallow whether or not your income is in fact subject to the 25% pass-through rate or the 35% ordinary tax rate, right? If the government is going to come up with these safeguards, then accountants are going to come up with ways around them, right? Because the minute you set up a differential, the minute you say if you earn your taxes, if you earn your income a certain way, right, you're going to pay a lower tax. Well, everybody wants to pay the lower tax. So everybody is going to try to convert their income. That's why a lot of these projections about how much the deficits are going to be impacted are wrong, because they don't understand how the tax changes themselves influence income. So all of a sudden, a lot of people who you thought were going to pay 35% because they were in the top bracket, all of a sudden they're only going to pay 25% because they are going to successfully circumvent whatever these safeguards are, because believe me, if the lawyers and the accountants are working with Congress on these rules and regulations, there are going to be ways around them. So what's going to happen is higher income taxpayers are going to end up paying accountants and lawyers all sorts of money to find a way to game the system and to get around whatever roadblocks they put in there to prevent people from getting out of the 35% bracket and into the 25% bracket. You know that is going to happen. And so it's going to mean that the tax code and the tax laws are a lot more complicated, and it's going to mean that people, individuals, are going to end up spending a lot more money. They're going to be paying their accountants and their lawyers a lot more money to do their taxes. Because if they do them right and they take advantage of whatever new loopholes get built in, they will be able to have a serious reduction in their tax. And obviously, some of that tax savings is going to be siphoned off by the tax industry, who will likely be in favor of this. So again, I've said this before, always beware whenever a politician is saying tax simplification, we're going to make things simple, they're not, right? They're going to make things more complicated. Just like the Patriot Act was unpatriotic, right? Tax simplification is tax complication, and this thing is already shaping up to be that. But what it really isn't is tax reform. Apart from the elimination of the estate tax and the lowering of the corporate tax, that's a little bit of a reform, but there's very little in this or nothing in this that's really going to transform our economy from consumption and borrowing to savings, investment, capital formation. That's not happening. We're not moving from an income-based system to a consumption-based system. We're not really broadening the base. We're not going to a flat. So I don't know why you call this tax reform. They're tax cuts, net tax cuts, and that means a loss of revenue to the government, which normally I don't care. I'm fine with the government losing revenue, but not if the government is not cutting expenses. They're going to continue to spend more money, right? They're going to continue to run bigger and bigger deficits. The deficits are going to blow through the roof as a result of these tax cuts and the increased government spending that's likely to accompany them, not only for the bailouts and the disaster relief, but all the infrastructure spending and building the wall and beefing up the military. And of course, as the economy goes into recession, we're going to have bigger and bigger deficits. Now, moving on, I want to go backwards to the Fed and Janet Yellen, because she gave an interview yesterday, which the markets interpreted as being very bullish. In fact, the odds of a December rate hike notched up a bit. The dollar strengthened. Gold was down about $10, and it was down about another $10 today. I think also a lot of that was enthusiasm for the tax cuts being announced, because these tax cuts are seen as being bullish for the U.S. economy, and so therefore bullish for the dollar. And so we're now back down to $12.83 or so on the price of gold, based on the tax cuts and based on Janet Yellen's supposedly hawkish tone when she spoke yesterday. But I didn't think she was being hawkish at all. I don't know why the markets were thinking that. I mean, she did say that there was a danger of the Fed raising rates too slowly, but she said there was a danger of them raising them too quickly also. And I think that's what the Fed is more worried about. In fact, Janet Yellen talked at length about inflation, basically said she had no idea why it was as low as it was. She basically said, we don't really understand inflation, which is one of the true things she said. I mean, the Fed doesn't seem to understand anything, but they certainly don't understand inflation. But the one thing that seems to worry Yellen is that inflation won't be high enough. That's what keeps her up at night, that it's going to be too low. It's the reverse. Inflation is going to be too high. That's what's going to come back and kill the Fed, because that's what they should be worrying about. Because if inflation is too high, they're stuck. They can't raise rates to try to rein it in because there's too much debt. The asset bubbles are too big. So they better hope that inflation stays low. And in fact, one of the things that Yellen said I thought was very dovish is she reiterated that 2% is not a ceiling, and that they're willing to allow inflation to overshoot 2% because they look at the overshoots the same they looked at the undershoots. So since we had inflation at 1% for a while, at least the way the government measures it, as far as Janet Yellen is concerned, we can have 3% inflation for a while because 3% and 1% average out to 2%. And what she said she's looking for is 2% inflation on average over time. So what Yellen was saying is, if inflation is 2.5% or 3%, we're not going to slam on the brakes, because we're just going to look at that as the flip side of what we had before, and we're just looking at a mean. So to me, that would be very dovish, because it doesn't mean that they're going to have to raise rates faster just because measured inflation goes up to 2.5 or 3%. But the markets didn't seem to care about that. They seemed to focus on the fact that she did say that there is some danger of moving too slowly, which is a vast understatement, because they've already moved too slowly and the dangers are already there. It's just that the whole thing hasn't completely blown up yet, but they already moved too slow. Rates should be a lot higher than they are right now. They should have already started to shrink the balance sheet. The balance sheet should be a lot smaller. Of course, had they done all those things, we would have already produced another financial crisis. So the reason the Fed has gone so slow is because they're afraid to go any faster. So they've gone about as slow as they thought they could get away with. But nonetheless, the damage has been done. And the damage has been exacerbated by the fact that rates have remained this low for this long, so that the debt is so much bigger now than it was before. The problems are so much bigger now than they were before. Yet Janet Yellen and her cronies at the Fed have no idea. And by the way, she's still on the short list to be reappointed, right? I mean, there's a couple of other people that Trump is apparently considering to replace Yellen, but she's there. I mean, she's got a very good chance of being reappointed according to the odds, or according to Trump. But of course, that's the opposite of what Trump says at a candidate. But Yellen and the Fed, they're completely clueless, at least publicly, on what's going on. The question is, do they actually believe what they're saying, or do they realize? I mean, did they go so slowly because they were really afraid to go faster because they knew how vulnerable we were? Or do they just really not have any idea? I mean, there's no way to know for sure whether it's incompetence, whether it's ignorance, whether they actually understand how bad things are, but they're just lying about it because they don't want to tell the truth, because they're afraid to tell the truth, and because they feel their job is really just to hype everything up, and they're really like a propaganda administration, and they're just trying to say good things to make us feel good, to try to hold off the crisis and instill as much confidence as possible, even though they have no confidence themselves. There's no way to really know this. But my gut feeling is that they don't. I mean, there's nothing in Janet Yellen's background that would lead me to believe that she has any clue. The only Federal Reserve chairman that I think knows what he's talking about is Alan Greenspan. And I think Alan Greenspan was full of shit the entire time he was Fed chairman, and I think he knew it. But I think the power went to his head. I think he enjoyed being popular, and I think he just played along with the system. He got in bed with the devil, and he enjoyed what happened there. But I think if you look at what Grant is saying now, you read between the lines, he refuses to be specifically critical of the Fed because, he can't really do that because, he wrote the playbook they're all following, and he was there, and he's in a glass house, so he can't really throw stones. But to me, he's Frankenstein, and he recognizes the monster that he created. And he knows how it's going to end. Because if you listen to him talking, we're headed for stagflation, the dollar's going down, you got to buy gold. So to me, the Alan Greenspan knew all along that what he did was wrong, and what Ben Bernanke did and what Janet Yellen did was even more wrong. But I have seen nothing that leads me to believe that Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen have the faintest idea how screwed up they've got this economy. And they're going to be completely surprised by what happens. And you know what? This is not something that's going to happen, many, many years in the future. I think it's going to happen in the next few years. It's going to happen during this Trump administration. And it is going to make what happened in 2008 look like a Sunday school picnic.